All right, I think we should get started. I want to welcome you all to this week's LaRouche PAC Saturday evening class series. I'm Susan Kokinda with LaRouche PAC here in the Midwest in Detroit. And tonight I'm joined by Tony Pappert in Virginia and Brian Lance in Houston, Texas. The title of this class series could not be more appropriate, Death by Globalization, or a Renaissance with the American System. And as we'll be discussing tonight, we're all beginning to experience the death of globalization and the paralysis and impact that this is having on our physical economy. This is one of the reasons why we have recently launched an initiative, a resolution which purpose is to begin to start the discussion with people throughout our society on a very fundamental principle. The very system of globalization has failed. You can't patch it up. The underlying principles of globalization, in which everything is monetized and financialized, has brought us to the point of the breakdown of physical supply chains, and more importantly, the inability of nations to actually produce what they need for national economic sovereignty. But I think for people to be able to confront the reality of the failure of globalization, you have to have in your head the idea that there is a new system. There is a different system that you can replace it with. And that is why we have launched an initiative, a resolution to re-Americanize the US economy. In order, as I say, to start the discussion, to be able to go to constituency groups, elected officials, political groups, trade unions, student clubs, but go to people and say, look, we have to start talking about the fact that this system has failed, and we want to present to you the basic principles of what a new system will look like. And of course, to let people know that it's not all that new. Alexander Hamilton gave this to us over 200 years ago. So I want to just briefly go to our website, and for those who may be joining us for the first time, to show them this resolution to Americanize the economy. It's very brief. I'm not going to review it tonight. We've gone through it in a number of recent podcasts, but the intention of this is for you to take this to groups and ask for their endorsement, which means you're going to have to organize them and you're going to have to educate them around that. And that is very much the reason why we are having this class series now. So without any further introduction on my part, I want to turn it over to Tony Pappert, who presented last week's very, very intense class on the question of economics having a very different subject than is generally presented. It ain't about money. It's about man's mind acting in the physical universe and acting on the physical universe. So Tony, why don't you take it away?
Yes, just a few introductory remarks. First, a huge paradox that, as Susan said, and as Brian is going to say more fully, the world is plunged into a deepening physical economic crisis. It's not only in the United States by any means. The cause is globalization, and Lyndon LaRouche predicted what is now happening in 2005, as I laid out last week. I don't want to take time by saying much more about the depth of the crisis, but at the same time as it's felt in pretty much every American home and store and factory, we know that lights are going out in China, lights are dimming in parts of Europe, as in Governor Newsom's California. Now, at precisely the same moment this is happening, Washington is fiddling around with a $4 to $5 trillion combination of economic legislation. But the paradox, which really illustrates the whole situation, is that nothing in these, let's say, $5 trillion of legislation, which failed to get a vote in the House this past week, nothing in there even pretends to address any part of the ongoing physical economic breakdown crisis. There's, for all the $5 trillion which is being discussed, there's no pretense that any part of that legislation will do anything to improve the disastrous situation that we face. It has no relevance whatsoever, except in at least two respects, to make the crisis still worse. One is, of course, the so-called green aspects of the legislation. I mean, even before being passed as legislation, these have had the effect of largely closing down exploration for new oil and gas in the United States, for reasons which may be obvious. Even before passage, the bill has contributed to skyrocketing energy prices and shortages. And then, of course, the other thing that's happening simultaneously, it's not part of the legislation per se, but coming out of Washington, is vaccine mandates, which already before Biden has been able to get, assuming he can do so at all, before he's been able to get a national vaccine mandate for all employers over 100 through, nevertheless, the mandates which have come down and the prospect of mandates has tremendously complicated an already existing labor shortage, which goes from the level of unskilled labor up to the most skilled jobs, which involves especially healthcare, police, fire and rescue, even before you add the complicating factor of vaccine mandates and people who are fired in many cases for refusal to accept vaccination. So I just wanted to begin with that shocking paradox. Now, what that exemplifies is that the American people on the whole are being oppressed by a malicious and ignorant and incompetent elite, which actually despises them. And as LaRouche has written, the response of the American people, the habituated response of the American people, is in part an American system reflex, a reflex in direction of the American system of economy, which Susan mentioned and which our resolution calls for, which was invented by Alexander Hamilton in the 18th century and which made the United States the world's greatest industrial power in the 19th century and again in the 20th century. Germany and Japan, using the American example and actual American advisors, adopted the American system of political economy in the 19th century, which resulted in their growing to position of leading industrial powers in Europe and in Asia. But today, although educated Japanese are aware of the American system of Alexander Hamilton, the Careys, Abraham Lincoln, it has been almost totally eliminated from our or as far as I know, actually totally eliminated from our officially accredited academic programs in the United States. Most Americans are really unaware of its existence. even though it was one of America's greatest gifts to the world, stemming from our roots in the European Renaissance. The extinction of the suffocation of knowledge of the American system in our colleges and universities and textbooks and so forth was a turning point in that, was the assassination in 1901 of our American system president, McKinley. And since then, President Donald Trump is one of the few recent presidents who openly espoused the American system and advocated its introduction, beginning during his election campaign. Now, in this situation at present, especially Republican politicians, come forth with slogans which appeal to the American system and which are intended to appeal to the American system impulse among Americans. For instance, the slogan that we're fighting for the capitalist system against the socialist system, the slogan of free enterprise. Now, as slogans, they are nothing but slogans, but the sad fact is no slogan or set of slogans, no matter how good, can qualify you to lead the United States back to the American system as a citizen, as a candidate for office, as many of you listening are or soon will be, as an office holder, as a staffer of a Trump second term beginning in 2024. Slogans don't do it. What's needed is factual, usable knowledge of the American system and what it is. And that's the purpose of this series. Now, you, the listener, if your background lies in the area of the physical economy, of production, distribution, utilities, agriculture, and so on, you have a great advantage if you use it, a great potential advantage in understanding the American system, which is what we require. Because economy, as I touched on last week in another way, economy is first and foremost a question of quality, not a question of quantity. And economy does not begin with equations. Economy cannot be expressed by equations, contrary to what college students are taught. Nothing they're taught has any relation to the real economy. If it did, why was it that there was no economics professor, there was no quoted economic specialist in the media who forecast the crisis which we find ourselves in right at this moment? And the more frank of them, now that we're sitting in the depths of this physical economic crisis, which at the moment is deteriorating, the more honest of them admit that they have no knowledge of what will happen. And they're offering, as I began by saying, they're offering no practical plan to get out of this crisis. So the fact that none of them knows what to do in this situation illustrates the fact that, in fact, none of them knows economics. And it's up to you, the viewer, to learn the American system of economy as invented by Alexander Hamilton, as carried through the 19th century under Lincoln, adopted in part under Roosevelt, aspects of it under Kennedy, and as worked out in much greater depth by Lyndon LaRouche during the latter 20th and the first part of this century. So that I just wanted to say that in the way of launching this session in view of the whole series of which it's a part. Thanks.
All right, Brian. People probably noticed that I posted the resolution in the chat. And Brian is going to give us, I think, some very powerful motivation around why we better get moving on this. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, well, so we're going to explore this physical economic breakdown. Over the recent months, I've been publishing a lot of material on LaRouche PAC in this regard, including on the breakdown of supply chains, the housing crisis, and so forth. So, and there's a short video on machine tools that I did with an interview with Bruce Director. He interviewed me, which is on the site right now. So I'm saying that to just kind of say there's more to this, and there's of course more that can be developed. But lean manufacturing, supply chains, and just in time, deregulation. These are some of the things we're going to talk about, and the necessity of moving from globalization and the collapse of globalization, which is ongoing, to a full set economy. And I'll come back to that, but an economy in which we as the United States can produce what we require in terms for our economic and national security. That's not to propose an autarky, but it's to propose that we, like every other sovereign nation, must, to the extent of its resources, ensure its sovereignty through its control of its credit, but also through its economic processes, productive processes, and most importantly, the development of labor, the development of its population, the development of its labor power. So, we look, and I think we're all on the same page on this. I think most people are aware of the crisis in shipping. The number of ships that vary 70, 80 or more of these huge container ships that are just stacked up in San Pedro Bay off the Long Beach and Los Angeles harbors, waiting just to unload shipments of goods ordered from inside the United States. On the huge backlog this has created, quite a fuss, and it doesn't end there. There's the once you get from the if you get unloaded at the berth, then you're loaded. Those goods are get loaded onto trains or trucks. But then those trains, for example, they've got to move those goods to loading yards, whether it be in Chicago or Dallas or points further east. When they get there, they're blacked up. Juliet, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, has recently experienced 25 miles of trains backed up, waiting to try to get into the railroad yards there, in which there's no space. The containers, these huge 52-foot containers, are stacked everywhere. In the Los Angeles shipyard, the containers are stacked 50 feet high. So you look at this, and then there's the question of, from the rail yards, why are they stacked up in the rail yards? Say in Juliet, well, because the truckers can't get them moved. Why? Well, first of all, there's not enough truckers, and so they're not able to move these goods. They're not reaching their recipients, the manufacturers, the wholesalers, and so on and so forth. So I'm just summarizing here quickly. This is a background, but that's not the crisis. That's not actually the real crisis. The crisis is, I'll just give you one way of thinking about it. We're headed towards a $1 trillion deficit this year. 1 trillion. We're going to import $2.5 trillion worth of goods. we're going to export 1.5 trillion, and the 1 trillion, well, that's the deficit. We're not producing. We're not producing what we require as a nation. That's the most essential key starting point. And it's not like that we don't have capabilities. I mean, we do. We just this last year, we've exported $182 billion worth of machinery. And we have these capabilities, electrical machinery. On top of that, that's another 130, 140 billion. So we have capabilities. We're not starting from zero, from scratch, but we're way down. So think about it. If we were producing, we wouldn't be facing this huge logjam in the entire supply chain. We wouldn't be choking, so to speak, on our own, on our own spit. To be very kind of vernacular about it. So the point is to shift from where we are into what has to be. So I'm going to outline some of of this in terms of the economic crisis that we've gotten in. And I've mentioned, look, I'm going to leave aside shipping. I think people know that situation. You can expand at this point the shipyards. You can do all kinds of hypotheticals, but it's there's a physical limit. Look at the rail infrastructure in this country. We went from 206,000 miles of rail in 1970 to 92,000 miles in 2019. The rail system of the United States, this is just class 1 rail, shrank by over half. The way the oligopoly, there's essentially 7 rail systems in North America. That's including the 2 in Canada, based out of Canada. But they've carved up the country, and they work now on the basis of what's called precision scheduled railroading. Well, what is that? Well, that's that each of, Union Pacific and so forth, they say, oh, well, we're going to decide, okay, which routes, these are fixed routes, they're going to run at fixed times, and we'll just adjust the rates up or down to make sure that those trains are full. And those trains are going to run at least 500 miles or more. They're going to be unit trains coming out of the ports, specifically the Los Angeles port in the case of imports coming in from China. And that's how we're going to run our business. And we're going to ensure we make a profit because we're going to control this process. And in doing so, we can cut our labor. They've cut the labor force of the railroads by half, just in the last decade or two, by half. So now when you come to the point of saying, well, we need to expand rail, well, first of all, the track isn't there. We haven't built the track, we've shrunk the track. And there's not the railroad workers to man the railroads. So the so-called precision schedule railroad. Now, what is this? This is an expression of what is called just in time. Also in a different way of lean manufacturing, just to get at those terms. Just in time. The idea is, well, gee, with digitalization, with big data and so forth, we can plan in advance. We know what we at such and such warehousing facility or production facility or one of these big box stores, we know what we need down the road because we can look at what the demand is right now. We can project where it's going to be. We can order in advance, and we can ensure that we don't have to have a lot of inventories on hand. We can have it delivered just in time. And so we'll save on inventories. We won't have inventory. We'll just make sure the goods get here on time. All right. And assembly manufacturing, the same concept, just in time. No inventories and no useless, quote unquote, useless labor. Nobody standing around. Only the labor we need right now at this moment. Lean manufacturing, then, of course, is that as well. We don't need inventories. We don't need to ensure, that we're backstopped with material and labor. We're going to run this as lean as possible. Well, okay, what happens when everybody's what happens when everybody is doing just in time and lean manufacturing, and there's a hiccup and there's a break in the supply chain, up and down that whole supply chain? Well, that's what's happened. It's not just a hiccup, but it cascades. There's a cascading effect. It's a cascading collapse, because in fact, what we've been doing is we've been running the economy on less than was required. We've in fact been cannibalizing the economy by setting up this kind of, it used to be called speed up, but it's really a modern version of speed up, and that's that sort of thinking, small-minded thinking about the productive process. So the railroads, to get back to the railroads very briefly, well, the railroads, they've increased their freight revenues per route mile. Just to give a figure, in 1970, they were making $58,000 per route mile. A route mile is 1 mile of their route, of all their railroad track. They were making $58,000 on every mile of that railroad track, as a way of figuring these figures, looking at it from the standpoint of capital investment and what is the rate of return. Well, in 2014, that was $823,000 per route mile. If you look at it from the standpoint of revenue per ton mile, that rate doubled between 2000 and 2018, 2019. The railroads doubled the income of the Standard & Poor 500 over the last 5 years. If I'm not advising this, but if you had invested in railroad stock, you would have made twice as much as the Standard & Poor's 500 went up altogether. That's the oligopoly of the railroads, which then has made that money by imposing this stripped down railroad organization, strip down the labor power and strip down the track utilization and maximize income, short-term gain. All of this, right? All of it is just simply saying, we want money now. We want cash now. This is the financialization, and these terms get bandied about, but this is the financialization that's gone on of the economy. We're not, the financial system, the circulation of money is not to serve the growth of the real economy, the productive economy. It's that the real economy is preyed upon by the financial process. So precision scheduled railroading is just an example of that. Freight, in terms of trucking, there's a trucking shortage. Again, labor shortage. Well, look, we've turned driving a truck into a living hell. In railroading, it was the Staggers Act, repealed in 1980. Stagger or Stager. In the trucking industry, it was the Motor Carrier Act of 1980. This is the Jimmy Carter era, but this process started even before Jimmy Carter with Ford and back to Nixon. But anyway, these major pieces of legislation of deregulation. The idea was, in part, was like with the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, this is going to allow manufacturers to reduce inventories, to move product more efficiently. And of course, that all works as long as you have a driver. By deregulating trucking, essentially drivers, anybody could enter the markets. They could charge whatever they could charge, or as little as they could charge to stay in business one day to the next. And you created a free-for-all rather than a regulated trucking system with routes. And that's the way it was with the regulation of the railroad system. The railroads it was regulated. They had to cover areas. They had to serve small towns. And once it was deregulated, that disappeared. The same with trucking. Small towns aren't blowing away in this country simply because people moved to the cities. It was because transportation networks and everything else disappeared over time, and people moved, because how could you run a business if you didn't have access to freight, to trucking or rail? So again, here's the outcome of deregulation. But the trucking shortage, there's over 10% of trucks for the major carriers are sitting. They're abandoned at this point. In fact, at this moment, they're being picked over for parts. This is one of the cascading effects. Is because the railroad, the trucking companies can't get parts for their own trucks because of the breakdown of the supply chain. So they're cannibalizing the trucks they have sitting because they can't get drivers, because nobody wants to drive. People don't want to be a long haul driver away from their families for three weeks at a time, under brutal conditions, long hours, and so on and so forth. And so the consequence is they're picking the parts of these trucks to keep their other trucks in motion. So the freight crisis is the shortage of drivers, and it's fed by the supply chain breakdown itself. So we can come back to that, but this has led to enormous hikes. A lot of the trade, 30% of freight is now on the spot market, rather than through carrier contracts. Desperate wholesaler outfits, companies, big box stores, etc., are going onto the spot market to find drivers, to find somebody out there that will move their freight when nobody else can get it moved. And each one of those involves a premium, a 35–40% premium over carrier prices. So the whole system is becoming disorganized and certainly completely deregulated, virtually anarchistic, in this scramble to try to move goods from point A to point B. So there's obviously more that could be said, but moving ahead here, oil and gas and chemicals. Natural gas and chemicals are manufacturing. They're manufactured products. And as we've seen with ESG, environmental, social governance policies promoted by Vanguard, BlackRock, and other financial institutions, promoted by the Biden administration, the attempts to cut off access to drilling rights, for example, mining rights, and this kind of thing. And much of this has been going on again for decades. But particularly in the course of the last 2 years, reversing the Trump policies, the Trump efforts to maximize and develop these resources. What do we now find? We have natural gas prices have doubled in the United States. They've gone up 5-fold in Europe. Natural gas, Yara, the big Norway-based ammonia producer, ammonia for fertilizer, has announced that it's closing 40% of its European-wide ammonia production because it can't get natural gas at a reasonable price. There's all kinds of knock-on effects. In the United Kingdom, the government is now bailing out a U.S. company there that produces ammonia to subsidize it because they were going to close their doors because, hey, there was no profit in producing ammonia. Well, if you don't have ammonia for fertilizer, your agriculture goes to hell. So these are just a couple of the knock-on effects. Chemicals, PVC, epoxy resins, ethylene for packaging. We've gotten reports. I'm sure other people have gotten reports as well from friends and so on. Companies, Nabisco or whatever, or Kellogg, they can't get packaging materials. Well, if oil prices double, the oil prices are now at a several-year high. They're up to $75 a barrel. That means your prices are going up for that. And then you have a few emergencies. The Texas Great Windmill Massacre, the so-called solar vortex that came down through the central part of the country, Hurricane Ida, and you start knocking some of that capability out, and so suddenly you don't have the supply. That means those prices are going up. The trucking prices are going up. The rail prices. Remember, Union Pacific and so forth. They charge what will guarantee that their unit trains, 750 containers a piece approximately, are filled. Well, right now, they can charge the sky's the limit and still fill those rail cars. So all of this is driving prices up, and we're just getting into the manufacturing end of it. The natural gas in Europe, just to give you a figure, $26 per million BTUs, British thermal units. Last year it was $4 per million British thermal units, just to give you a figure, so you know what we're talking about here. Okay, so let's talk about manufacturing itself. This is the real economy. If it's not producing, or it's producing under essentially breakdown conditions, then that's what creates the chain reaction collapse of what's identified as the supply chain crisis. Okay, well, what's going on in manufacturing? Well, let's take machinery. Machinery is $140 billion export, or 180 this last year, $180 billion export industry from the United States, out of a $1.4 trillion industry globally, producing, manufacturing machinery. All right. It was the case that in terms of capital assets, the growth of capital assets held by the machinery industry, that increased 20 to 50% a year. Lathes, other machine tools, other equipment, what was needed to maintain productivity, to grow productivity, and so forth. Now, over the last few decades, that growth is down to 3%, and that's probably not even keeping up with real depreciation. Manufacturing employment is down to 12 million, approximately. These are moving figures, but approximately 12 million people in the United States. That's down from 20 million. 1/3 of manufacturing workers qualify for welfare and get welfare. 1/3 of manufacturing workers get some kind of welfare because their pay scales are so low, supporting them and their families, that they qualify and receive welfare, so-called welfare programs, SNAP, and so on and so forth. That was before COVID. All right, so if people have a glorified idea of the manufacturing sector and standards of living, we've been cannibalizing the labor force. I'm not blaming factories, this factory or that factory or this manufacturer and that. They're operating under conditions of what? Lean manufacturing and just in time. To stay competitive, they've got to drive down costs, so they do what's necessary to stay in business, to survive. This has shrunk the manufacturing capabilities of the country. I think you could go to the slide, you could skip over the first slide, Susan, but go to the next. There's a series of 3 slides here. That's what we got to build. We got to build back better. This is Los Angeles Harbor. You see, these are the rail lines. They go directly from the wharfs out and across the country. Next slide. All right, here is manufacturing durable goods. Okay, durable goods, heavy manufacturing. And here you're looking at it from the late 1960s, 1967 to be exact. And you're looking at it up to, if you can see it all the way on your screen, up to 2021, beginning mid, say, 2021. And you're looking at capacity utilization. Even while manufacturing capacity has been shrinking, look at this up and down. Look at this boom bust process, where it was back in the 67 that we were operating at close to 95% capacity. 95% capacity takes into account downtime that's required to maintain equipment and so on and so forth. So it's not an artificial, this is not an artificial capacity utilization figure. It's taking into account those kind of variables, the kind of downtime required. But look at the boom bust. And if you noticed, anyway, far over to the right, it continues. And of course, we know what happened in terms of COVID. And the Federal Reserve here has been nice enough to put in a darker blue every time there's a financial crisis in the United States. And you see what happens to manufacturing in those, you see those dark blue shadows, relatively dark blue, and then you see the plunge in factory utilization. The next slide. Thanks, Susan. Here's the machine tool manufacturing in the United States. Again, I just wanted you, I put this up here, that we're now talking about machine tools. Machine tools are about 10% of machinery manufacturing. Machine tools, as we've discussed, otherwise elsewhere, and as I said, there's a short interview right now on the website on this subject. But machine tools are the means by which scientific breakthroughs in fundamental discoveries in the noosphere, as we will, fundamental discoveries are translated into the productive process, and man transforms nature, and we increase productivity. Ever since, we've had crisis after crisis, and this began in 1971 when the dollar was, Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. More importantly, he devalued the dollar, and the consequence of that and the ensuing speculative process that was set in motion the financial crises that then erupted again and again and again ever since, which has wreaked havoc on the machine tool sector, the most valuable part of the U.S. economy, because of this role that it plays of taking new scientific breakthroughs, taking the proof of principle of those scientific breakthroughs, and developing prototypes, developing new machine tools to realize those prototypes in actual production. You can take the example of the development of lasers, for example, now used in machine tools, advanced machine tools. It's just a simple example of a totally new, revolutionary technology that was brought to bear. Well, we're right now, well, let's put it this way. The U.S. used to export, this was in 1968, we exported 28% of all the machine tools into the world market, 28%. In the 60s into the early 70s, we were the world leader in machine tool production, the best high quality machine tools. With the 71 financial crisis, we went to hell. But there's another side of that. That was just when they were developing CNC machine tools, computer numerically controlled CNC machine tools. And then the development of CAD, computer-aided design, that utilize those machine tools. Higher precision, higher performance, higher output. Well, we developed those capabilities at places like MIT and so forth, but with the crash in 71 and the aftermath, remember, well, not 71, it began with that, but then that led to the first financial bubble And then you had Volcker's high interest rate policy and the collapse that brought on 20% interest rates, if you remember, in 1980, beginning of 1980, that crashed the machine tool and manufacturing industry. Well, as a consequence, that CNC capability that we had developed in terms of a new capability was picked up and developed in Japan and Germany instead. Today, Japan and Germany lead the machine tool production in the world. They export more machine tools than we produce in the United States. If you could go to the next slide briefly, this will be the last graph here. I don't mean to bore anybody with graphs, but if you see here, this is the import by price. So you know that's a little bit can skew things a bit. But from the 1990s on up to today, the actual imports of U.S. machine tools. We now, as I said, export 5%, or perhaps I didn't say it, I was going to say it. We export now 5% of the world's machine tools, from 28% down to 5%. About $2.3 billion a year. At the same time, we're importing machine tools into the United States because the high-end machine tools are largely produced in Germany and Japan. How long can we remain a manufacturing economy if we can't even produce our own machine tools? If we're relying on others to produce the machine tools, the scientific breakthroughs and the transformation and utilization through the machine tool principle that Lyndon LaRouche identified and developed, that capability, that takes place elsewhere. That takes place in Japan and Germany and increasingly in China. China is the largest machine tool market in the world now. And it's one of the largest machine tool producers, and the quality is going up. And of course, they're going to utilize that. So, this is how we've been losing our toolbox. You know, the U.S. it's not gone, but we're losing the toolbox by which we produce, and that means costs are going up. It means we're dependent on imports. We're dependent on this whole just-in-time lean manufacturing process. And so we don't have what we need produced here at home by our own skilled workers. Just as a final example of that, in terms of tool and die workers, which are the high-end, most skilled part of the machine tool employment area among machinists, tool and die. Tool and die, in 1998, there was 162,000 tool and die workers. Today, there's 61,000, basically 1/3 of what there was 20 years ago. So obviously now there's cloud computing, and this is supposed to be a substitute. And with cloud computing, we can somehow manage the supply chain crisis, but you can't manage it if you don't have drivers, if you don't have a rail system, most importantly, if you can't even produce yourself. There's other features of this, very briefly, the housing crisis. You know, we have a 3 million unit housing shortage. That's a very conservative figure from a study done by the National Board of Realtors. That's 3 million in terms of a shortage of entry-level homes. We've gone from in 1970, we produced 480,000 entry-level homes a year for young families of working families. We're now down, sadly, to producing 65,000 houses in a year, from 480,000 to 65,000 houses a year. That's with 2.4 million families, young families out there trying to find a place to live. So we're under, I'm bringing this up as that the final point is just the labor force again itself. We're not training, we're not developing the labor force. We're not ensuring the conditions for family formation, for reproduction, and we're seeing that in terms of the falling rates of population growth or lack of growth. So, and we're not even talking about gig economy workers and so on and so forth. Again, all a byproduct of lean manufacturing, just in time, and the rest. So it's as we have again and again developed here, and we'll continue to develop, and as our resolution emphasizes, it's a return to the American system. Labor, as Abraham Lincoln again and again stressed, labor precedes capital. Labor has to be developed to grow capital. Capital in terms of investment plowed back into agriculture and industry and science. The American system is about frontiers. That means the space program, fusion energy, Project Artemis, launched by President Trump. We've got to drive this process of labor development, of education, of workforce, as we've developed with the Space CCC proposal. The labor side of this is absolutely critical. We're at a point where our workforce is coming out of COVID. They're looking around, they're disoriented. A lot of our workforce is disoriented. People are saying, well, we need to go back to what was before. But what before was not real. It was already a devolving process. About 20% of our workforce is actually employed in productive work. That is making the physical changes on nature, say 20, 25% max. The rest is overhead, services, etc. Some of it necessary, but it's got to be realized through a productive workforce that makes the physical changes on nature for mankind, specifically for this nation. So people are looking around, and we've got to reorient them to where we have to go from here. And we have a great history to draw upon. We have the ideas of Plato, Socrates, Leibniz, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, Lincoln, Roosevelt, LaRouche. We have the American system. It's going to take some Yankee ingenuity, a lot of Yankee ingenuity. Thank you.